We're going to continue from our previous video where we created a query and the resolver to resolve the data from our database and return it to GraphQL. So inside of GraphQL Yoga here, we're able to run the cart query, give it an ID. If this ID doesn't exist, it will create it in the database. And like we explored in Prisma Studio, if we go here now and we add an additional cart, this cart doesn't exist. If we go back to Prisma and we refresh, we can see we have a new cart with that new ID that I passed. If we run the query again, that same cart is returned. If we go back to the database, you can see here, it didn't add anything additionally. It just returned that cart that already exists. We also made it so that the subtotal returned a formatted amount and also the actual amount itself that I calculated by adding together the quantity, multiplying that by the price, and it returned that and formatted it as well. We then used some JavaScript to reduce our array of items and get the number of items and return that as an integer. Now we don't have anything in our items yet because we haven't been able to add a cart item inside of GraphQL, and that's what we're going to focus on in this video. So the first thing that we'll need to do inside of our code editor is open up the GraphQL schema file, and here we'll need to declare a new mutation. And the way to do that inside of our schema definition here is to use the keyword type, then we can pass mutation, and then inside of here is where we can have our list of mutations. And the name of the mutation here will be add item, and that will take some arguments, and we can use parentheses to do this. I'm going to use a typical input object type convention, which is to pass one argument here and give it a name of input, and then we'll give a input object type name here. So we'll call this add to cart input, and we'll make that non-nullable. And for this mutation, we actually want to return the cart as well. So further on down, I'm now going to use that special keyword input, and we're going to call this add to cart input. Then inside of here, this is where we can declare all of the different values. And I'm now going to pass the cart ID. We need to know the cart ID because we need to know what cart to add the item that we're providing the data for. Then we'll pass ID as a scalar type ID. We'll then give it a name of string. We'll also specify that we have a description, which is non-nullable. And if we look at the top here in our cart item, we said that the description here is also non-nullable. But we don't want to pass things like the unit total or line total because we can calculate that inside of our GraphQL resolvers, like we've seen with the total items and the subtotal for our cart. Then we'll pass an image as well in our input type, and then we'll add price to our add to cart input type here. And this will be a non-nullable field of type int. And then we'll specify quantity here. Well, that will be of type int as well. But in this case, we'll make sure that the default value is always 1. And we can do that by using equals 1 here. I'm now going to run npm run codegen, and this will update the types.ts file, and it will execute the GraphQL code generator to take in the schema here and update the different types that are generated. Now if we look inside of types.ts file, we should see that we have the add to cart input added as a exported type, and it contains all of the different scalar types and what fields those are and whether or not they are optional. And if we scroll down, we can now see that our items, we have cart items, and everything just seems to be working as it should. Our GraphQL types are all in here, and now we can use this inside of our resolver for adding items. Now inside of our resolver map, I'm going to specify that we want to create a new mutation. And here we can see with the GraphQL code generator that it's already telling me that it's expecting add item. So if we click add item now, this will be an asynchronous function that we can run, and this will resolve adding a cart item and returning the overall cart. So similar to the cart resolver, we'll call async. We'll ignore the first argument, but we'll destructure input from the second argument here, and then we'll destructure Prisma from the GraphQL context. And if we hover over input here, we can see that the type is add to cart input. And if we hover over Prisma, we can see that this is a Prisma instance. So this is the GraphQL code generator working. We have our resolvers all typed for us. So now we can write code inside of our resolver, and we can see here that we have a red squiggly line for add item. This is because what we're returning isn't what the GraphQL code generator is expecting for this add item mutation. So that's what we'll implement now. So the first thing that we'll need to do is actually get the cart. Now, we could duplicate all of the code that we have above to fetch a cart if it exists and if it doesn't, create one. But instead of duplicating that, we'll actually create a new function, and we'll call this function find or create cart. And we'll create that in just a second, and we'll pass two arguments here. The first will be Prisma, and then input.cartID for the second. Then we'll call await Prisma, and this time we'll use cart item, and we'll use the special upsert method. We'll either create or update where we have an ID for our cart. So the first thing that we'll do is create a cart item, and we'll pass cart.id. We'll then pass the ID of the cart item, and we can get this by calling input.id. Then we can do the same for name, description, and image. And then we can do the same for price. We'll do something similar for quantity, but we'll add a fallback here just in case, and we'll say this is 1. Now if we hover over here, we can see that we have an error, and that's because we're not defining everything that upsert expects. We'll next specify that if there is a cart item by the ID that we passed, that we just want to update the quantity of that cart item. We want to leave everything else as is. And for the quantity, we actually want to go ahead and increment the quantity for that cart item. And we'll do input.quantity, and we'll fall back to 1 if that doesn't exist. And for where, we can use the special ID underscore cart ID unique constraint that we defined inside of our Prisma schema. In here, we can pass ID, and then we can pass the cart ID, and we can get this from cart.id. Then all that's left to do is we will return the overall cart. Now you may have noticed that find or create cart doesn't exist. So we'll go ahead now, and inside of our lib folder, we'll actually create a new file, and we'll call this cart.ts. We'll import Prisma client, and then we'll export a new async function, and we'll give it a name of find or create cart. The first argument will be of the Prisma client type, and the second argument, that will be an ID, which we know is of type string. Then if we go back to where we have the code for our cart, we can take this, copy that, paste it inside of here, and now we've got everything working as it should. Next, what we'll need to do is remove the contents here, and we'll do return find or create cart, and we'll pass it Prisma from the context, and we'll pass it that ID. So for the query, we are now finding or creating a cart, passing in Prisma and the ID, and for our mutation, we are calling that same function, passing Prisma and the cart ID. If we scroll up, that has automatically been imported for me as I've typed, and that's a feature of Visual Studio. If not, you'll need to declare this import find or create cart, which is a named export from the file cart inside of our lib folder. Now inside of the terminal, if we run npm run dev and start the next server, if we head on over to localhost 3000 now, if we take the ID for our cart and we create a new mutation, and we'll call add item, we can see here that this expects the input type, and if we click on input type, this will open the documentation, and I can see exactly what fields I need to pass. So inside of here, we'll pass cart ID, and we'll give it that 1 week GraphQL. Then we'll give it a cart item ID, and we'll say this is 1. Then we'll give it a name, and we'll call this shirt. Then we'll specify the price here as 1000. Then I will get back the ID of the cart, the total items, subtotal, and the formatted amount. And let's get the amount for good measure. Now if we run this, we'll see we now have 1 item, and this is the total. We can go further and expand our query here, and return the ID, the name, and the quantity for our cart items. And we can see here that we have the ID 1, and the name of our product, which is shirt, and then we have the overall quantity. This is 2 because I've just ran that mutation once more. If I run it again, this should say 3. If we now update items to return unit total, and we want to fetch the formatted amount, or the line total amount and formatted amount for those, if we now run this, this will not work. This will return an unexpected error, and this is a feature of GraphQL Yoga called error masking. What's actually happened here is that we don't have a resolver for unit total or line total, and we'll need to implement that next. Back inside of our resolver map, for the root cart item type, we'll need to specify the line total and the unit total here, and the resolvers for both of those. Now let's go ahead and declare the unit total resolver, and we'll fetch item from the first argument. And here we just need to specify the amount, which is item.price, and then we need to return an object which contains the amount and the formatted value. To calculate the value of the formatted amount, we can use currency formatter that we imported previously, and then we can call format. Then we can pass the amount divided by 100, and then as the second argument inside of the object, we can pass the currency code variable that we created above. Then for line total, we can do the same by fetching the first argument from the resolver function that's passed. Then we can declare the amount, and here the amount will be item.quantity multiplied by the item.price. Then we can do exactly what we did above. We can copy this, paste this, and return it. And now if we go back to our cart and we add an item, we should now see that we have our unit total, which is the one item in our cart. And then we should have the line total, which is the amount here multiplied by the quantity. And we can see here this is 5,000 or $50.